Good evening, everyone. Tonight's story takes us back to Victorian Britain, a time when fresh air, something we now consider healthy, was viewed with deep suspicion. This is the tale of shuttered rooms, fearful physicians, and a society convinced that the moving breeze itself was dangerous. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed a slight dip in the channel's reach, and one of the simplest, most effective ways to support us is by subscribing. It's free, it only takes a moment, and it truly helps us keep bringing you these fascinating stories. Thank you so much. Now, let's begin. If you enjoy videos like this, please give it a like and subscribe, and do tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always remarkable to see our little community spread across the world. Dim your lights, perhaps put on a fan for that gentle ambient hum, and let's step quietly into the past together. I was born in 1843, the year the Thames froze over and the factories of Manchester began to pour their smoke into an already grey heaven. My first memory is not of light, but of its absence. The drawing room of our townhouse in Bloomsbury, where the velvet curtains hung so thick and still that they seemed part of the architecture itself. They were bottle green, those curtains, lined with holland cloth and backed with buckram, and they never moved. Not in summer, when the sun pressed against them like a beggar at a locked gate. Not in winter, when frost made lace upon the window panes behind them. They hung year after year, like the walls of a fortress built against something we could not name but feared absolutely. The air inside that room had a taste. I can recall it now, 70 years later, sitting by this open window in Sussex with the salt wind coming up from the Channel. It was the taste of dust that had settled and risen and settled again, of coal smoke that seeped through every crack despite our efforts, of furniture polish and the particular sourness of fabrics that never quite dried. Beneath it all ran something else, the faint sweetness of decay, of things slowly mouldering in the dark. But we did not think of it as decay. We thought of it as safety. My father was a physician, which is why I know what I know, and why I believed what I believed for so long. He had trained at Guy's Hospital in the 1830s, when the miasma theory held sway like scripture. He spoke of bad air the way a priest speaks of sin, as an invisible corruption that entered through the pores and nostrils, carrying with it every manner of wasting and fever. The cholera outbreak of 1832 had killed his first wife, my elder sibling's mother, and he spoke of it rarely but with a horror that never diminished. He had seen the blue faces, the way the flesh seemed to collapse inward, the terrible speed of it, and he had concluded, as many medical men did, that the disease travelled on the night air, on the exhalations of the river, on the breath of crowds and the vapours of the streets. Our house was arranged according to this belief. Every window that could be sealed was sealed, with putty and felt and sometimes boards nailed across the frames. The chimneys drew constantly, pulling the coal smoke up and out, but the flues were fitted with special baffles my father had designed himself to prevent any return of air. We had double doors between rooms, and these too were kept closed. The servants moved through the house like ghosts, opening one door only after closing another, maintaining the separation of atmospheres as carefully as one might separate clean water from foul. In winter, this seemed almost natural. London winters in those years were things of legend, the great fogs that turned day into dusk, the coal smoke that settled over the city like a sodden blanket, yellow-brown and tasting of metal. We would wake to find the fog had somehow penetrated even our sealed rooms, a thin haze that made the gas lamps bloom with fuzzy halos. My father would move through the house checking seals, his medical bag always at hand, as if the fog itself were a patient that might at any moment require treatment. He carried spirits of camphor in a small bottle and would dab it beneath his nose before venturing out, a custom he had learned from older physicians who remembered the plague. But it was summer that revealed the true cost of our precautions. June and July in London, the sun hammering on the rooftops, the streets baking until the tar went soft and horses left dark hoofprints in the roadways. Inside our house, the heat accumulated like water in a cistern. By afternoon, the drawing room would be stifling, the air so thick and still that one moved through it as if through honey. My mother, who suffered from what was then called nervous exhaustion, would lie on the chaise with a dampened cloth across her forehead, her breathing shallow and quick. The maid would come with fresh cloths dipped in lavender water, and the scent would join all the other scents in that unchanging atmosphere. The coal smoke, the furniture polish, the dust, the peculiar sweetness of fabrics that never saw sun. I remember asking my father, when I was perhaps 7 years old, why we could not open a window. Just one, just for an hour. The heat was making me ill, I said. I felt I could not draw a full breath. He knelt beside me. He was a tall man, with side whiskers and a watch chain that caught the gaslight, and he explained it to me as if I were already his student. The air outside, he said, was not what I imagined. It seemed clean because it moved, but movement was deceptive. The very motion of air allowed it to gather and carry miasms, the invisible exhalations of disease. Every person who coughed into that air, every open sewer, every dead thing rotting in an alley or floating in the Thames, contributed its poison to the general atmosphere. The air flowed through the city like a river, and like a river it collected filth as it went. When wind blew, it carried this corruption faster and farther. When it was still, the miasms settled and concentrated, particularly at night, when the dew fell and seemed to press the bad air down close to the earth. Inside our house, he explained, we had created a refuge. The air was our own. We had breathed it and rebreathed it, yes, but it was familiar air, domestic air, free from the wild contamination of the streets. We warmed it carefully with coal fires that drew upward and away. We cleaned it as best we could with fresh herbs and vinegar water sprinkled on the floors. Most importantly, we kept it separate from the great poisonous sea of atmosphere that surrounded us. He told me of patients he had treated, women of good families who had insisted on taking the air, who had walked in parks or sat by open windows, and who had subsequently fallen into consumption or brain fever, or any of a dozen other maladies that seemed to follow the opening of a window as night follows day. He spoke of children who had played in gardens and come home with fevers that no medicine could touch. He showed me diagrams from his medical books, illustrations of how bad air entered the lungs and from there corrupted the blood, spreading its taint through every organ until the body surrendered entirely. I believed him. How could I not? He was my father, and he was learned, and all around us people faded from the room with terrible regularity. The family across the square lost 2 children in a single summer. 3 doors down, a young wife who had been healthy at Easter was being measured for her coffin by Michaelmas. The newspapers reported deaths by the thousands during the hot months. The wasting took the old and young alike, and scarlet fever moved through the poorer districts like a scythe through wheat. If the closing of windows and the sealing of rooms could keep such horrors at bay, what price was too high? I became my father's apprentice when I was 14. This was unusual. Most young men of good family would have been sent to public school and then to university before approaching medicine. But my father, having lost his first family, had grown both protective and determined to pass his knowledge forward. My mother, weakened by her various complaints, had produced no more children after me. I was to be his inheritor, his continuation, and he educated me accordingly. My apprenticeship consisted partly of books, the great texts of medicine and anatomy, the learned journals from Edinburgh and Paris, but mostly of observation. I accompanied my father on his rounds, carrying his bag, watching as he examined patients in houses very like our own. Everywhere we went, I saw the same arrangements. Windows sealed or covered, fires burning even in summer, rooms maintained at temperatures that seemed barely compatible with consciousness. The wealthier families had special sick rooms prepared, painted in calming colours, and furnished sparsely to avoid collecting miasms in fabric and wood. These rooms were often in the interior of the house, away from any exterior wall, insulated from the corruption outside by layers of domestic space. The patients I saw in those rooms have stayed with me all my life. They lie in my memory like pressed flowers, flat and faded, but retaining their essential shape. There was Mrs. Bellingham in Marylebone, who had not left her bedroom in 3 years, convinced that any change of air would prove fatal. She lay propped on pillows, her face the colour of tallow, her breath coming in small sips. The room smelled of camphor and something underneath it, something sweet and wrong. My father prescribed beef tea and a strengthening tonic, and cautioned her husband most strictly against opening any window, no matter how she might beg for it in her delirium. The bad air, he said, would finish what her illness had begun. There was Colonel Ashford in Mayfair, a veteran of the Afghan wars who had survived battles and sieges, only to be brought low by what my father called a miasmatic fever contracted during an ill-advised evening ride in Regent's Park. He lay in a room so dark and hot that I felt my own chest tighten upon entering. The curtains were not merely closed, but fastened with pins every few inches, as if light itself were the enemy. A fire burned in the grate despite the August heat. The Colonel's face was grey, his eyes sunken, his breathing laboured. My father applied a blister to his chest, a preparation of cantharides that raised the skin in angry wheals, and administered doses of mercury and antimony. The treatment, he explained to me later, was intended to stimulate the body's natural defences and to purge the accumulated poisons. But the room, he emphasised, must remain sealed. Fresh air would undo everything. I remember asking quietly as we walked back to our carriage whether the room itself might not be harming the Colonel, whether the heat and darkness and that particular smell, like a larder that needed cleaning, might not be worse than any risk from an open window. My father stopped in the street and looked at me with something close to alarm. That way of thinking, he said, was dangerous. It was the kind of modern notion that got people killed. Yes, the room was uncomfortable. Yes, the treatments were harsh. But medicine was not meant to be pleasant. It was meant to be effective. And the evidence was overwhelming. Patients who opened windows died. Patients who remained sealed and followed prescriptions survived, or at least had a chance of survival. Would I prefer comfortable death to uncomfortable recovery? I had no answer to that. I was 14, and the world seemed very certain of itself. By the time I was 18, I was effectively practicing alongside my father, though I would not receive my formal license for several more years. I'd learned to take a pulse, to examine a tongue, to listen to the sounds of breathing, and determine from them the state of the lungs. I'd learned to bleed patients when their fevers ran too high, to apply leeches when inflammation threatened, to prepare and administer the various medicines that might restore the body's proper balance. And I had learned, above all, to maintain the seal. Every treatment, every prescription, every prognosis depended on keeping the patient separate from the poisoned air of the world outside. It was in 1861 that I first began to notice the contradictions. I was 19, and we had been called to attend a family in Shoreditch in the East End. This was unusual. My father's practice was generally confined to wealthier districts. But the patient was the daughter of a cloth merchant who had done well and wanted the best care money could buy. The house was narrow and dark, wedged between a tannery and a warehouse, with the constant rumble of cartwheels on the cobbles outside and the smell of the tannery pervading everything, a thick animal reek of hides and lime. The girl was 12, the same age as my younger sister would have been if she had lived. She lay in an attic room, under the eaves, in a space so cramped that my father had to stoop. The single window was not merely curtained, but boarded over, and a fire burned in a small grate, making the room almost unbearable. The girl had been there for 6 weeks, her mother explained, ever since she'd developed a cough and fever after playing in the street. The local doctor had prescribed complete rest and isolation from all air. She had been given various tonics and twice been bled, but the cough had only worsened. Now she could barely draw breath. I watched my father examine her. He placed his ear against her back and listened to the crackling sound of her lungs. He looked at her tongue, which was coated and grey. He took her pulse, which was rapid and weak. Then he stood, bumping his head on the sloped ceiling, and gave his opinion. The girl's lungs were inflamed, he said, likely from exposure to bad air before she was properly confined. The treatment must continue. Complete rest, sealed room, regular doses of ipecacuanha to promote expectoration, and another bleeding to reduce the fever. On no account should the window be opened or the fire allowed to go out. We left the house and walked back toward our carriage. Behind us I could hear the girl coughing, a wet, desperate sound that seemed to follow us down the narrow street. I found myself thinking about the workers I had seen on our way through Shoreditch, dockers and factory hands, costermongers and chimney sweeps. They lived their entire lives in the open air, such as it was. They breathed the smoke of the factories and the stench of the river and the cold, thick fog of winter. And while many of them certainly succumbed to various wasting illnesses, many did not. They walked the streets hale and whole, breathing air my father would have deemed instantly fatal. I mentioned this to him as our carriage rattled westward. He listened, his face turned toward the window, watching the city pass. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry more weariness than I had heard from him before. The poor, he said, were differently constituted. They had to be, or they could not survive in the conditions they inhabited. Their bodies were hardened by necessity, though at what cost we could only guess. Many of them faded young. Their children died in numbers we could scarcely credit. Those who survived to adulthood were often stunted, diseased, carrying within them the seeds of corruption that would one day flower into full illness. We, he said, meaning our class, our kind, did not have such constitutions. We were more refined, more sensitive, more vulnerable to the insults of bad air. Our very breeding, which gave us intelligence and sensibility, and the capacity for higher feeling, made us also more susceptible to atmospheric poison. It was the price of civilization. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that the girl in Shoreditch dying in her sealed attic seemed to be paying rather a high price for civilization. But I was 19, and my father was 48 and distinguished, and I had been trained to believe in the authority of experience. So I said nothing, and we rode home through the afternoon light, which even at its brightest seemed filtered and grey, as if the whole city were enclosed in dirty glass. That summer was particularly hot. The Thames stank so badly that Parliament considered relocating. The papers called it the Great Stink, though those of us who had lived through previous summers found it merely an intensification of the usual reek. My father's practice increased dramatically. The heat seemed to drive all manner of illness, and there were days when we visited a dozen houses, each one sealed and sweltering, each patient gasping in their private atmosphere. I began to dread these calls, not for the illness itself, though that was distressing enough, but for the rooms, the terrible stillness of them, the way the air seemed to lie in layers, warm at the ceiling and merely hot everywhere else, the sounds, small sounds, intimate sounds, that had nowhere to go and so accumulated like the dust. It was in July of that year that my mother's condition worsened. She had been declining slowly for years, her nervous exhaustion taking the form of headaches, breathlessness, and a general inability to tolerate exertion of any kind. She spent most of her days in her private sitting room, which adjoined the drawing room and shared its sealed and curtained darkness. My father attended her constantly, adjusting her medicines, monitoring her pulse, ensuring that the room remained properly sealed against any infiltration of outside air. I remember the morning she asked for a window to be opened. It was early, perhaps 6 o'clock, and I was reading in my room when I heard her voice through the walls. Not calling out exactly, but speaking in a tone of such desperate entreaty that I went immediately to investigate. I found her standing by the window of her sitting room, actually standing, which she rarely did, with her hands pressed against the heavy curtains as if she might somehow will them aside. She wanted air, she said, just for a moment, just one breath of air that did not taste of coal and dust and her own exhalations. She said she felt she was drowning, that the room was pressing in on her, that if she could not have one breath of clean air, she thought she might go mad. My father arrived within moments. He had heard her from his study. He took her gently by the shoulders and guided her back to her chair. He spoke to her softly, as one speaks to a frightened child. The feeling she described, he said, was a symptom of her condition. The nervous exhaustion created false sensations, made her believe she needed things that would in fact harm her. The outside air, particularly in summer, particularly at this early hour when the miasms of night still clung to the earth, would be disastrous. It would rush into her weakened lungs and from there to her blood and brain. It would undo months of careful treatment. She must trust him. She must be patient. She subsided then, as she always did. My father prepared a draught of laudanum, and she drank it obediently. Within minutes her breathing had slowed, her eyelids had grown heavy. She sank back into her chair, and the room settled into its familiar stillness. My father adjusted the curtains, though they had not been disturbed, and checked the seals around the window frame, though there was nothing wrong with them. Then he turned to me. "Stay with her," he said. "Make sure she does not attempt to open the window. In her state she cannot be trusted to act in her own best interest." I sat with my mother all that morning. She slept fitfully, her breath coming in small gasps, her hands occasionally moving as if reaching for something. The room grew warmer as the sun climbed outside our sealed fortress. I found myself watching the curtains, those heavy green curtains, and wondering what lay behind them. Not what I could see if I drew them back. I knew what was there, the street, the square, the plane trees. But what was really there? What was the air actually like? Was it truly the poisonous miasma my father described? Or was it simply air, moving and changing, carrying with it the smell of grass and horses and the distant river? My mother woke at noon. She looked at me with eyes that seemed both present and far away, the laudanum still clouding her thoughts. She asked me if I believed my father, if I truly believed that the air outside was dangerous. I hesitated, and in that hesitation I felt something shift, some small certainty becoming uncertain. I told her I did not know, that I had been taught to believe it, had seen evidence that supported it, but that sometimes I wondered. She smiled then, a sad and knowing smile, and told me that she had wondered too. For years, she said, but wondering and acting were different things, and she was too afraid, or too weak, or too tired to do anything but continue as we had always continued. She faded from the room 6 weeks later. The end came quietly in the early morning, with my father and myself at her bedside. The room was as it had always been, sealed, warm, heavy with the scent of medicines and decay barely disguised. My father said it was her heart that had finally failed, weakened by years of illness. He recorded it thus in his records. But I have always wondered whether it was not her heart so much as her will, whether she had simply grown too tired of breathing the same air, over and over, in the same dark room, year after year after year. After her passing, I expected my father to change, to open the windows of her sitting room at least, to let some light and air cleanse the space where she had suffered. But he did not. He had the room closed entirely, the furniture covered in Holland cloth, the curtains drawn and the door locked. It became a monument to his beliefs, a sealed chamber that no one entered. Sometimes at night I would stand outside that door and listen, as if I might hear something, some sound that would tell me what I needed to know. But there was only silence, the same silence that had ruled that room for so many years. I continued my training. I passed my examinations at the Royal College in 1864 and became officially a physician in my own right, though I continued to practice alongside my father. Our work went on unchanged. We moved through a London that was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to alter its understanding of disease and air. The works of Edwin Chadwick and the sanitary reformers were gaining influence. Florence Nightingale had published her observations on nursing and the importance of ventilation. There were physicians, younger men mostly, who spoke of fresh air as a treatment rather than a danger. But my father dismissed these notions as dangerous fads, likely to pass once their proponents had seen enough patients fade under open windows. It was in 1866 that I met Catherine Morse. She was the sister of one of my father's patients, a young man recovering from what we believed was a miasmatic fever, contracted while travelling on the continent. I'd been sent to check on him, while my father attended another call, and I found the patient much improved, but the sister looking rather worse than when I had last seen her. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly, and when I inquired after her health, she confessed that she found the atmosphere of her brother's sick room unbearable. Would it be terribly wrong, she asked, if she stepped outside for a moment? Just into the garden? I found myself telling her yes. Do go. Take all the time you need. She looked at me with surprise and gratitude, and disappeared down the stairs. I heard the back door open and close. Through the sealed window of the sick room I could not see the garden, but I imagined her there, breathing air that moved, that carried the scent of earth and growing things rather than medicines and coal smoke. When she returned 15 minutes later, she did indeed look better. Colour in her cheeks, steadiness in her hands, a lightness in her bearing that had not been there before. I found myself wanting to ask her what it had been like, that air, but the question seemed absurd. I knew what air was like. I breathed it every day, such as it was, in the narrow passages between buildings as I moved from carriage to door. But I did not know what it was like to breathe it deliberately, to stand in it and let it move around one, to treat it as something good rather than dangerous. Catherine and I began to correspond. This was entirely proper. She had questions about her brother's treatment, and I provided answers. But the letters gradually expanded to include other topics. She told me of her childhood in Somerset, where her family had kept a country house with gardens that ran down to a river. She described summer afternoons spent outdoors, the scent of roses and newly cut hay, the feel of wind in the long grass. She wrote of these things with such vividness that I could almost smell them, almost feel them, there in my sealed study in Bloomsbury. I wrote to her of my doubts, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. I told her of the contradictions I had observed, the poor who lived in open air and survived, the wealthy who died in sealed rooms despite every precaution, the way patients seemed to improve when I forgot to caution against an open window, and declined when I remembered. I told her of my mother, and the morning she had begged for air, and how I had done nothing. Catherine wrote back with observations of her own. She had nursed her mother through a long illness, she said, and had noticed that on days when she managed to open a window, even briefly, her mother had seemed to rest easier. She had read Miss Nightingale's notes on nursing and found the sections on ventilation persuasive. She wondered whether the medical profession's fear of fresh air might not be a kind of superstition, no different from older fears of witchcraft or bad omens. She knew this was an audacious thing to suggest, she wrote, but she could not help noticing that the rooms where people seemed to suffer most were always the rooms that felt most like tombs. We married in 1867. My father disapproved, not of Catherine herself, but of her ideas, which he considered dangerously modern. He warned me that if I allowed such thinking to influence my practice, I would have the demise of my patients on my conscience. But I was 24, and certain in the way only the young can be certain, and I believed that truth was more important than tradition. Catherine and I took a house in Kensington, a narrow building with good light and a small back garden. The first thing she did was open every window. I stood in the drawing room and watched as she pulled back the curtains I had installed, as she unlatched the sashes and pushed them up, as air that had not moved in months suddenly began to circulate. The sensation was extraordinary. It was not that the outside air was cleaner. This was London in 1867, and the air carried its usual burden of coal smoke and street dust. But it moved. It changed. It brought with it the smell of the garden, of rain on stone, of life beyond our walls. I found I could breathe more deeply than I had in years. The tightness in my chest, which I had thought was simply my natural constitution, eased. Colours seemed brighter, sounds clearer. I stood at that open window and felt the wind on my face, and I understood for the first time what my mother had been asking for. We kept the windows open all that summer. Neighbours remarked on it, some with approval, many with concern. My father refused to visit, convinced that we were courting disaster. I waited for illness to strike, for some terrible confirmation that the old ways had been correct. But nothing happened. Catherine and I remained healthy. The house did not fill with miasms. The air did not poison us. I began cautiously to alter my practice. When patients asked about ventilation, I no longer automatically counselled against it. I suggested that perhaps, in moderation, with proper precautions, a little fresh air might be beneficial. I stopped prescribing the complete sealing of sick rooms. I even, in a few cases where the patient seemed to be declining despite all treatment, suggested opening a window. The results were inconsistent, as medical results often are. Some patients improved, some declined regardless. Some recovered without any intervention at all. But I began to notice a pattern. The patients who seemed to do best were those who had some circulation of air, some variation in their atmosphere. Those who languished in sealed rooms, breathing the same air day after day, tended to develop a peculiar lassitude, a greyness of spirit that seemed as dangerous as any physical disease. By 1870, I had moved away from my father's methods almost entirely. I no longer believed in the miasma theory, or rather, I believed that the miasmas we feared were not those borne by wind and weather, but those we created ourselves through lack of ventilation and an excess of coal smoke and human exhalation. The bad air, I had come to think, was inside, not outside. My father and I had a final conversation about this in the spring of 1871. He was 61 then, beginning to show his age. His practice had diminished. He had driven away many patients with his insistence on methods that were increasingly seen as old-fashioned. He came to our house in Kensington one afternoon, and I made the mistake of having the windows open. He stood in the drawing room, looking at those open windows as if they were wounds in the walls of the world. Then he turned to me and asked if I had any idea what I was doing, if I understood the responsibility I was taking on by abandoning proven methods for modern fancies. I told him I thought the proven methods were not as proven as we had believed, that I had seen too many patients die in sealed rooms to think that sealing was itself protective, that Miss Nightingale's observations on ventilation seemed borne out by experience, and that the new sanitary science suggested that circulation, not stagnation, was the key to health. He looked at me with something like grief. Then he told me I was killing my patients, that I might not see it immediately, but that the consequences of my actions would become clear in time. That fresh air was a slow poison, and by the time I realized my error, many people would have faded because of my arrogance. I asked him whether any evidence would change his mind. Whether, if I showed him patients who thrived with open windows, or studies that suggested ventilation was beneficial, he would reconsider his position. He said no. He said that some truths were fundamental, and no amount of modern theorizing could alter them. The air was dangerous. That was a fact as established as gravity or the circulation of blood. To deny it was to deny reality itself. We did not speak again after that day. He returned to his practice, such as it was, and I to mine. I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that he had sealed his house even more thoroughly than before, that he had taken to wearing a respirator when forced to go outdoors, that he had covered his windows not just with curtains but with painted boards that allowed no light through at all. He was trying, I think, to live out his beliefs to their logical conclusion, to prove through his own survival that he had been right all along. He faded in the winter of 1873, in his sealed study, breathing air that had not been refreshed in weeks. The maid found him slumped at his desk, surrounded by his medical journals, a candle burnt down to nothing beside him. The room, when I entered it to make the arrangements, was suffocating. The smell was indescribable. Coal smoke and dust and something else. The smell of complete stagnation. I opened the windows then, even though it was too late to matter, and the air that rushed in was cold and clean and carried the scent of snow. In the decades since, I have practiced as I think best. I have kept windows open, have advocated for ventilation and light, have tried to treat the whole patient rather than merely ward off invisible dangers. I cannot say that all my patients have thrived. Medicine is not so simple, but I can say that I have seen no evidence that fresh air is harmful, and much evidence that its absence is devastating. The world has changed. London is still grey, still smoky, but it is not sealed against itself as it once was. The great sanitary reforms have brought clean water and proper drainage. The miasma theory has given way to germ theory, and we now understand that diseases are caused by specific organisms rather than bad air generally. The hospitals that once kept their windows nailed shut now insist on thorough ventilation. Florence Nightingale's principles are taught to every nurse. The things my father believed and taught me to believe are now seen as dangerous superstition. And yet I cannot entirely condemn him. He did what he thought was right. He protected those he loved the only way he knew how. That it was wrong does not mean it was not sincere. That it failed does not mean it was not attempted with the fullest commitment. He lived in a world where people faded constantly, where the wasting and the fever and the slow decline were so common as to seem inevitable, and he tried, in his way, to hold them back. I am 82 now. I sit by this window in Sussex where Catherine and I retired 5 years ago, and I watch the wind move through the garden. We have roses here, and lavender, and an ancient apple tree that blooms white in April. The windows of this house are never closed except in the hardest rain, and even then I find I want to open them to let the weather in. Sometimes I think about that girl in Shoreditch, the one in the sealed attic room. I never learned what became of her. Most likely she faded, as so many did. But sometimes I imagine that someone opened her window. That air flowed in, air that carried the smell of the tannery and the sound of cartwheels and all the rough life of the streets. That she breathed it and found it good, and that it gave her strength enough to rise. I think about my mother, standing by her window begging for air. I wish I had opened it for her. Not because I am certain it would have saved her. I am old enough now to know that certainty is itself a kind of prison, but because she asked and she deserved to have her request honoured. Because sometimes what we need is more important than what we have been taught is safe. The curtains in my father's house, the ones that hung in the drawing room for all my childhood, were removed after his passing. I oversaw the emptying of that house, and I had the workmen take down every curtain, every seal, every board that covered a window. The windows themselves were painted shut by then, and we had to use tools to pry them open. When they finally gave way, the sound was like a gasp, and dust rose from the sills in clouds, years and years of accumulated dust that had settled because there was no air to carry it away. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had opened those windows earlier, if I had challenged my father's beliefs when I was younger, or opened my mother's window despite his orders, or refused to seal the houses of my patients. Would it have made a difference? Would any of them have lived who died? Or would I simply have caused a different set of tragedies, been haunted by a different set of ghosts? These are questions without answers. I can only sit here with this window open, with the salt wind coming up from the channel, and be grateful that I learned to question what I was taught, that I learned to trust my own observations over received wisdom, that I found my way, however slowly, however imperfectly, to this simple truth, that air must move, that light must enter, that houses cannot be fortresses against life itself without becoming tombs. Catherine is in the garden now. I can see her from this window, kneeling by the herb bed, her hands in the earth. She's 78, and her hair is white, and she moves more slowly than she once did. But she is here, breathing this moving air, living in this house where the windows open and close with the weather and the seasons. We've had 57 years together, not all of them easy. Medicine is not a profession that allows for ease, but all of them in houses where air flowed and light entered, and we trusted that the world outside was not our enemy. I have no great conclusions to offer, no final wisdom distilled from decades of practice. I can only tell you what I have seen, that fear is its own sickness, that safety and life are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the cure we think we need is worse than any disease. The window is open. The wind is moving through this room as I write, stirring the papers on my desk, carrying the scent of lavender and salt. In a moment I will close this journal and go down to the garden to join Catherine. We will sit in the evening sun, if there is sun, or in the evening wind if there is not. We will breathe this air that has travelled over the channel, over the fields, over the roses and the lavender. We will breathe it without fear, without calculation, without the belief that it carries our destruction in its invisible currents. And if I could speak now to my younger self, to that boy standing in the sealed drawing room in Bloomsbury, watching the dust motes hang motionless in the dim gaslight, I would tell him this: the air is not your enemy, the world is not a plague house, and the fortress you build against fear will in the end become indistinguishable from a prison. I would tell him to open the window, but I was that boy, and I did not know, and so I lived as I lived. I sealed windows and prescribed confinement and watched patients decline in their dark rooms, and I believed I was saving them. It took me years to understand that sometimes salvation and suffocation are difficult to tell apart, that love and fear can produce identical actions, that my father, sealing the windows against the night air, thought he was protecting us, and perhaps in his own way he was, not from the air itself, but from his own terror of what might come through it. There is a photograph on my desk, faded now to sepia tones. It shows our house in Kensington as it was in 1870, the year after we married. You can see the windows, open, with the curtains pulled back and tied. If you look closely, you can see Catherine standing at one of them, her face turned toward the camera, her hand resting on the sill. Behind her, through the window, there is only darkness. The photograph could not capture what was outside, only the fact of the opening itself. But that opening, that gap in the wall where air flowed and light entered, says everything that needs to be said about how we chose to live. I have kept that photograph all these years, not as a monument to my own correctness. I was right about some things and wrong about others, as all physicians are, but as a reminder of what it cost to change, of what it took to look at everything I had been taught, everything my father believed, everything that seems certain and proven and safe, and say, I think this might be wrong. It is easy now to look back and see how obvious it all was. The sealed rooms that smelled of decay, the patients who grew paler and weaker the longer they were confined, the terrible stillness of air that had nowhere to go. But it was not obvious then. It was heresy. It was dangerous modernism. It was the abandonment of proven wisdom for the sake of fashion and theory. And perhaps I would have remained in my father's world, sealing windows and prescribing confinement, and believing I was doing good, if not for my mother's face that morning, pressed against the curtains, begging for air. That image has stayed with me more vividly than any medical text or any learned lecture. The desperation in it. The way she seemed to know, in some part of herself that had nothing to do with medical theory, that she was being suffocated by the very measures meant to save her. I failed her. I did not open that window. I sat and watched as my father gave her laudanum, and she sank into drug sleep, and I did nothing. That failure has shaped every decision I've made since, every window I've opened in every sick room, every time I've counselled ventilation over ceiling, every patient I've told, go outside, walk in the garden, breathe deeply. I've been trying, for 50 years, to open the window I failed to open for her. Perhaps this is not wisdom at all. Perhaps it is merely guilt, transmuted into practice. But the results speak for themselves. My patients have lived or faded according to the natural course of their illnesses, not according to the quality of their ventilation. And those who lived did so in rooms where air moved, where light entered, where they could smell the rain and hear the wind and know themselves to be part of the world rather than sealed away from it. I think often of those curtains, the bottle green velvet ones from my childhood, lined with holland cloth, backed with buckram, hanging so heavy and still that they seemed to absorb sound as well as light. They were beautiful, in their way, expensive, well made, chosen with care by people who loved me and wanted to protect me, and they were instruments of suffocation. How many beautiful things are also instruments of suffocation? How many careful protections are prisons? How many expressions of love are actually expressions of fear? These are not medical questions, but I have spent my life as a physician thinking about them, because medicine is finally not about theories or prescriptions or even cures. It is about how we choose to live with our inevitable fragility, whether we face it with open windows or sealed ones, whether we trust the air to carry us or fear it will destroy us. The sun is setting now. I can see it through this window, dropping toward the horizon over the water, turning the channel gold and pink, and finally that deep blue that comes before darkness. Catherine has come in from the garden. I can hear her in the kitchen setting out our supper. In a few minutes I will join her, and we will eat together by the open window, with the evening wind moving through the room and the sound of the sea in the distance. This is how we have lived. This is how we will continue to live for whatever time remains to us. Not in fear of the air, but in communion with it. Not sealed away, but open to the world in all its danger and beauty. Not protected from life, but participating in it, breathing it in and breathing it out, until at last the breathing stops and we become part of the air ourselves, part of the wind that moves through other people's windows. I have written this account because I am old, and because the world I knew has largely passed away, and because I want there to be some record of what we believed and why we believed it. Not to mock those beliefs, they were sincere, and born of genuine love and terror, but to show how beliefs can blind us, how fear can make us certain, how the things we do to protect ourselves can become the very things that harm us. If you are reading this in some future time, when the medicine I practice has itself become obsolete, when the things I am certain of have been proven wrong, I hope you will judge us gently. We did what we thought was right. We tried to save those we loved. That we sometimes suffocated them in the attempt does not mean we did not love them, but I hope too that you will remember this, that air must move, that light must enter, that life cannot be protected from itself without ceasing to be life, that there are worse things than danger, and one of them is safety purchased at the cost of breath. The window beside me is still open. The evening wind is cold now, carrying the promise of rain. Soon I will have to close it, not from fear, but simply because the weather is changing and we are old, and the cold finds our bones more easily than it once did. But it will open again tomorrow. It will open every day that weather permits, and on some days when it does not, because we have chosen to live this way, in this house with these windows, in this trust that the world beyond our walls is not our enemy. I stood once in my father's sealed study after his passing, and I felt the weight of all that stillness, the air that had not moved in weeks, the dust that had settled and would never rise again, the silence that was not peace, but the absence of life. I opened those windows and watched the dust clouds rise and swirl and finally dissipate, carried away by wind that had been excluded for so long it seemed almost violent in its entry. That is what truth can feel like when it finally enters a sealed space. Violent, disrupting, carrying away things that seemed permanent, but also necessary, also cleansing, also, finally, a kind of mercy. I'm tired now. My hand aches from writing, and the light is failing. But before I close this journal, before I go down to Catherine and our supper and our evening by the open window, I want to say one more thing. To anyone who lives in a sealed house, whether the ceiling is literal or metaphorical, whether it is done with boards and putty or with fear and habit, and the conviction that safety lies in separation, open the window, just once, just for a moment. Feel what it is like when air moves through a room that has been still too long. Smell what the world smells like beyond your walls. Listen to the sounds that come from outside your own breathing. It may be dangerous. I cannot promise it will not be. Life is dangerous. Air carries dust and pollen and the exhalations of strangers, and sometimes, yes, the seeds of illness. But it also carries rain and roses and the salt smell of the sea and the scent of grass after a storm. It carries life, and life, even with all its risks, is better than the slow suffocation of perfect safety. My father would disagree. He would say I am counselling recklessness, that I am leading people to their destruction with my modern notions and my dangerous optimism. Perhaps he would be right. Perhaps in some future time physicians will read this account and shake their heads at my naivety, my failure to understand some truth about air and illness that will by then be obvious to everyone. But I do not think so. I think the truth I have learned is one of those fundamental truths that does not change with fashion or theory, that life requires breath, and breath requires air, and air requires movement. That we cannot seal ourselves away from the world without sealing ourselves away from ourselves. That the fortress becomes the tomb, and the protection becomes the suffocation, and the love that closes the window is in the end indistinguishable from the fear that nails it shut. The light is nearly gone now. Catherine is calling me. The wind through this window smells of the sea and the coming rain and the lavender from the garden. In a moment I will close this journal and go downstairs. Tomorrow I will open it again, and the day after, and the day after that, until there are no more days and no more words and no more windows to open or close. But tonight, this window is open. The air is moving through this room where I have written these words, and that finally is all I have to say, that the window is open and the air is moving, and I am still here to breathe it. That will have to be enough.